Welcome back to the We See Monsters channel. I'm your host, Jenna, and I have a really unsettling encounter that takes place during a Boy Scout camping trip. I think this story is a prime example of why we shouldn't dismiss children when they tell us they either saw or heard something creepy in the woods. Campfire stories are a staple at summer camp growing up, but when that shit actually happens, it can be pretty traumatizing. Anyways, I hope you all are ready for this one and enjoy this week's story. I've definitely heard some strange stories, but the one that bothers me the most is the one that happened to me. My son is in the Boy Scouts, and I'm fairly involved as a leader in his troop. So, most of the time when his troop goes backpacking, I go too. On one of these trips, we'd just reached our camping spot after a long day's hike. There were still a few hours of daylight left, so after everyone had gotten their tents and gear set up, most of the boys took to exploring the area around the campsite. Another hour or so went by, and this thick, heavy fog rolled in. Everything went dead quiet. The birds were no longer chirping. The leaves stopped rustling in the wind. Total silence. Even the words we spoke seemed muffled by the fog. Along with that silence, I began to feel weighed down by this really oppressive sense of what I can only describe as offness. It felt completely unnatural. The other leaders and I were concerned some of the boys could get lost or hurt in this fog, so we called them back to the campsite and counted them off to make sure everyone was present and accounted for. The boys are taught to always have at least one buddy with them at all times, so we counted each scout and confirmed their buddy was with them. The last boy we got to was in sort of a panic. He told us his buddy, a younger scout named Adrian, had wandered off and, after the fog rolled in, was nowhere to be seen. Everything kicked into high gear after that. We told the boys to stay at the camp, and two of the adult leaders stayed with them, while the rest of us went out looking for the missing boy. We had radios with us, so we could communicate if we lost sight of each other. I decided to backtrack down the trail we initially came in on, in case Adrian had wandered back that way, and eventually came to a spot where I could make out his outline in the fog. As I approached him, I noticed his back was to me, and he was standing stock still, facing the woods. I spoke his name softly, and he seemed startled, like he had been in some kind of a trance. I asked him what he was looking at and why he'd come back down this part of the trail. He looked up at me with an expression that was a mixture of bewilderment and worry, and told me that when we'd first passed this spot while we were hiking in, he'd heard what sounded like soft laughter and voices deep in the woods. He came back to investigate, thinking it must have been coming from another campsite. It made sense, but it didn't explain why he'd just been standing there, staring. As I pressed him for more answers, he hesitantly told me that shortly after he'd started down this trail, the fog had rolled in. He wasn't aware that his buddy wasn't with him. He was more interested in finding out who was in the woods. When he'd arrived at the spot, he stopped to listen. As he had been standing there, trying to see through the fog, he noticed a very tall, he heavily emphasized the word very, pale man peering out from behind a tree at him, while also being partially obscured by the fog. As he stood staring, Adrian said that he noticed more people scattered around the nearby trees, also peering at him. Not saying anything, just peering at him with blank expressions. He said that one or two of them had made slow hand gestures, like they wanted him to come over to them, and he had suddenly felt very tired. That was when I'd found him and startled him, bringing him out of that trance-like state. I looked around and didn't see or hear anything. No birds, no insects, and definitely no people. There was just us and that heavy, oppressive fog. As I started to glance back down at him, I caught a tiny movement out of the corner of my eye. I looked up and for one brief moment, caught a glimpse of one of the people he had described. He was staring at us with a blank and hollow expression as he backed further into the fog and melted away. If you've ever been to an open casket funeral, you know how the person you're looking at in that wooden box looks so much different than they did in life. They look more like a wax figure straight out of the uncanny valley. That's what the face of that man reminded me of as he was engulfed by the mist. I stood in stunned silence for a moment. As soon as I snapped out of it, we hightailed it back to camp, and I radioed the other leaders to let them know that I'd found the missing boy. Eventually, the fog lifted, but that feeling that I felt earlier remained. I still feel that same sense of disquiet whenever I think about that freakishly tall man and his blank, uncanny stare. It's stories and encounters like that that haunt me when I'm backpacking through the mountains. For more spooky content, you can click the link below to check out my TikTok and listen to the We See Monsters podcast.